Welcome back, you guys. Today we are making a chocolate matcha cake. I had so much fun last week making that olive oil cake that I wanted to keep kind of experimenting with some different flavors, and the star of the show today is some matcha. So we're going to start off by making our cake base. We're then going to divide it between two bowls. We're going to add matcha into one and chocolate into the other. And that's going to allow us to create some beautiful alternating layers of chocolate and matcha cake. And it's just an amazing combination. So a few notable differences about this recipe versus my normal vanilla layer cake recipe. One really big thing is that we are using cake flour today instead of all-purpose flour. We also are using whole milk instead of buttermilk just because we don't want the tang of the buttermilk to kind of compete with the wonderful flavor of the matcha. So if any of you guys aren't familiar with matcha, it's really just powdered green tea, and you can find it at most specialty grocery stores or at Whole Foods, which is where I got this. If you can't find it, you can always order it online. You want to make sure when you're getting your matcha that it just says it's green tea powder. You don't want anything that's sweetened, and then of course you don't want anything that's in tea bags. So just keep that in mind as you're looking. There's a lot of great brands out there that you can use. So number one, before I make our batter, I just turned on my oven and I'm preheating it to 350 degrees. Next, I'm going to add in my dry ingredients. I'm starting with my cake flour, and I have here 3 1/4 cups of cake flour. We're just going to pour that right into the bowl of our stand mixer. If you don't have a stand mixer, you can also use a hand mixer. Just be sure not to overbeat the batter because you want this cake to be really nice and delicate and fluffy, and you don't want to ruin that texture. Next, I'm going to add in 3 cups of granulated sugar. In here I have 2½ teaspoons of baking powder, and I also have 1 teaspoon of salt. And then I'm just going to slowly pulse these until they're incorporated. You don't want to turn your mixer on high here, or else you're going to have an explosion of flour, so just be careful. The next step is to add in our butter. And when you add in your butter to all of your dry ingredients like this, it's called reverse crumbing. So in here I have 1 cup of butter, which is just 2 sticks of unsalted butter. We'll let that mix just until the butter is incorporated and the mixture begins to look a little bit crumbly. So now it's time to add in our egg whites and our milk. So in this bowl I have 1 cup of whole milk, and I also have 1 cup of egg whites. I like to use egg whites out of a carton just because they're easier to manage and it's less wasteful, so I don't have to deal with all the yolks. But if you don't have those on hand or you don't have them where you live, you can always use just 7 egg whites. So I'm going to mix in half of this mixture. Give that a nice pulse. And then we'll add in the rest. So as you do this, be sure to pulse so that you don't have any explosions coming out of your bowl. So now that our batter is ready to go, I'm going to evenly divide it between 2 bowls. I'm going to use a kitchen scale to make sure that it's really nice and even. We're going to mix in our matcha and our cocoa powder. First I got to pop the top on this matcha. To help make sure that our matcha really incorporates smoothly, I'm going to use a sifter to add it in. I don't know if you guys can see, but there's definitely some little chunks in here, so this is such a good idea. You don't want to add it straight in or else you're going to be mixing for a really long time. Just try to get all those clumps out. I'm going to whisk until the matcha is fully incorporated. Next, we're pretty much going to repeat the same process with our chocolate cake batter. So I'm just going to take some baking cocoa and I'm just going to sift it right into my cake batter. So we're just going to whisk this together as well, and then we're going to get this into some prepared pans. I love using parchment paper because it really helps your cake layers release easily from your cake pans. In addition to this parchment rounds that we just cut, we're also going to spray a little bit of nonstick cooking spray. So I do a pretty light spray, and I just like to go around the sides of the cake pan to help those layers release once it's baked. Now it's time for the fun part. We're going to fill our pans. So I'm going to start with my green tea cake batter, and I'm just going to pour it evenly between 2 of the pans. So this cake batter is pretty thin, and it's fine. It's going to bake up just fine, but just be very careful as you pour it. Next, we're going to add in our chocolate cake batter and pop these into our 350-degree preheated oven. So while our cake layers are in the oven, we're going to whip up a batch of my American buttercream. By now you guys know this recipe is so simple. It's literally butter, salt, vanilla, powdered sugar, and a little bit of heavy cream. Of course, we're going to be incorporating a little bit of matcha into it, but first we're going to start with our vanilla base. So to level our cakes, I'm taking my serrated knife. I'm going to make it parallel to my counter, and I'm just going to slowly rotate the cake while I cut. And I'm going to try to keep my serrated knife at the same height as I do this, and that's going to allow me to get a nice level cut. So again, you guys, I'm not applying a lot of pressure. I'm really letting the knife do all of the work until that top pops right off, just like that. So I'm going to repeat this process with my remaining cake layer, and then we can start to build this cake. Because my frosting has been sitting around for a bit, it's developed some air bubbles. So I'm going to give it a really quick stir to get it nice and smooth again. So it's definitely an arm workout, and you want to get all the way to the bottom of the bowl, just really stirring it around. And by doing this and working the frosting back and forth, you're pushing all that air out of the frosting, so you're going to be left with super smooth, super creamy frosting, just like when you finished making it and it came out of the mixer. Now that our buttercream is super smooth, I'm going to use my large offset spatula to just add a little dab onto my 10-inch grease-proof cake board. And this is going to help just keep that bottom layer in place as we build our cake up. I'm going to go ahead and start with my first matcha cake layer here. I'm going to add a very generous dollop here of my buttercream onto our cake. And this is really a preference, you know, I like buttercream a lot, but if you don't like frosting as much or you want the cake to be a little bit less sweet, you can always use less. If you want to use a frosting that's a little bit less sweet, you can totally use a Swiss meringue or whatever your preferred buttercream is. Next, I'm going to use my chocolate cake layer. I'm going to pop this guy right on here. So I'm just working the frosting gently to the outside of each layer, and I'm not pulling up a lot because you want to reduce the amount of crumbing that happens. So I work it to the edge and then I give my cake a nice little spin, get a smooth finish. I just repeat that as I build the cake up. So I'm having a very gentle hand as I'm doing this. I'm not applying a lot of pressure because our cake layers are room temperature, so they're going to slide a little bit as we're frosting. So don't worry about that. If your layers get a little bit less symmetrical, don't worry at all. You can always adjust them just like that. And it happens sometimes, you know, if your buttercream isn't insanely stiff, if your kitchen is a little bit warm, or if your cake layers weren't chilled, you're going to get some sliding. And that's totally fine. Just make sure they're nice and straight, and then go ahead and pop your final cake layer on top. Now that our layers are stacked, it's time to add on our crumb coat. Another thing too to make your life easier is you can freeze your cake layers before you decorate. Take them out about 20 minutes before. They'll still be cold to the touch and they'll help that buttercream firm up, and that makes it a lot easier to frost. So I'm definitely having my layers slide a little bit, which is fine. If you are really struggling with this though, you can definitely use a skewer to help keep them in place. While this was chilling, I covered my buttercream with a piece of saran wrap and I put it right against the top of the frosting. It's important that you do that because this is a crusting buttercream, and if you don't, it's going to get a really hard layer on top, and that's just caused by all the sugar that's in the buttercream. So it's totally natural when it's exposed to air, but you can prevent it by covering it. So I'm going to give this a quick stir, like I mentioned earlier, because as it sits, it can get air bubbles in it. I'm also going to add in 2 teaspoons of matcha powder to give our second coat of frosting a really beautiful color and an amazing taste. So I'm adding a very generous layer of this matcha frosting to our cake. So this cake is going to end up being about 6 inches tall because my bench scraper is about 6 inches. If you wanted to make a shorter cake, you could totally use 7-inch or 8-inch cake layers and make fewer cake layers. So with my remaining buttercream, I'm going to put it into a piping bag that I fitted with a small French tip to create some fun little accents on the cake once it's decorated. Like I mentioned earlier, we're going to be decorating this cake with 2 different types of drips. So we're going to be making some white chocolate ganache and some regular chocolate ganache. So to each bowl, I'm going to add 1/3 of a cup heavy cream. And if you can't find heavy cream, heavy whipping cream works just as well. They have a slightly different percentage of fat in them, but they're both going to work great for this. However, you can't use milk in place of this. You need something with a lot of fat to get the right texture. So I'm going to pop these into the microwave for 30-second intervals until they just begin to bubble, and then we're going to add in our chocolate. So to our 1/3 cup of heavy cream for our white chocolate ganache, I'm going to add an entire cup of mini white chocolate chips. So to 1/3 of a cup heavy cream, I'm going to add 1/2 cup of regular chocolate. So I've let both of these mixtures sit for about 2 minutes, and the heat from the bowl and the heavy cream should have melted the chocolate. So let's give this a quick little stir. It might take a minute, but slowly it will come together. So I know that it looks broken in the beginning, and you can almost see bits of the heavy cream, the fat from it. But as you continue to stir, you're going to get this really smooth, rich mixture just like this. So we're scraping the sides of the bowl to make sure that we're really getting everything mixed together. And just like that, our chocolate ganache is ready to go. Next, we'll work on our white chocolate ganache. So I'm just going to make some small circles in the center of my bowl and then slowly work my way out. So I popped my white chocolate ganache into the microwave for another 15 seconds and then just gave it a good stir, and all the little pieces melted right up. So you can see we've got a beautiful consistency. It's nice and thick. It's not too hot, but it is pretty yellow. So to this, I'm going to add a tiny bit of purple gel food coloring. I've actually never done this before, but you know, a trick for frosting, if it has a yellowish tint to it from your butter, is to add a tiny bit, because purple and yellow are opposites on the color wheel. I'm going to add a tiny bit more. That is pretty amazing. Okay, you guys, so now our ganache is quite a little bit less yellow. It almost looks a tiny bit gray, but I think when it goes onto the cake, it's going to look more white than it did before. We're going to start with our white chocolate ganache strips. So I'm going to scrape off the bottom of my spoon. We're going to slowly push it over the edge. Just like that. Now to do this, I'm just adding a tiny bit of ganache onto my spoon, and I'm going to be spreading these out pretty wide. And the reason I'm doing that is because we're going to be adding some chocolate ganache onto this too. And we want to leave space for our chocolate drips. So this method is definitely a lot slower, but you're going to get some really elegant big drips this way. So I'm not opposed to the bottle method, and I actually advise doing that if you're new to drips because I think it's much easier. But this way really can be a lot of fun as well. If you want to see a tutorial with a squeeze bottle, which I think is a lot easier, where I really go over all of the basics and all of my tips and tricks, you can click the link in the upper right corner. So next we're going to add on our chocolate drip here. So we're going to follow the same technique of getting about a teaspoon or less of ganache on our spoon. And we're just going to go ahead and add some chocolate right onto here. So we're first going to do our test drip and just see how that goes. Looks like our chocolate is a lot thicker, and we might actually need to heat this up a little bit more. It's a pretty sad dollop. I'm going to heat it up a little bit more. I've heated up my ganache for about 20 seconds. Go back over that spot that didn't work out so well last time. I'm hoping to get more of a drip this time. And we've got a drip! So we're getting some really thick, kind of luscious drips. And that's totally fine. If you want thinner drips, you can heat your ganache up a little bit more. But I'm kind of into this like thick drip that we're getting. They're actually pretty dramatic almost. I really love how they kind of compare to the white drips. So now that we have our little drips on our cake, we're going to add some chocolate ganache to the top of it just to cover it up and smooth it out. Perfect. So the first thing I'm going to add to the cake are these cream-filled wafers. The next thing I'm adding are some Pocky that are matcha flavored. And then I also got these ultra slim chocolate Pocky. Pocky? To decorate this cake, I wanted to create kind of a crown around the top of it. So I started with those cream-filled wafers, which I think are just beautiful. And then I filled in between them with both the green tea or the matcha and the chocolate Pocky. My one note is to be careful as you insert them into the cake so that they don't break. To fill in the rest of the cake, I used some of our extra matcha frosting and a Wilton 21 tip, which is just a small French tip, to pipe some fun frosting dollops around the cake. I also filled in with a bit of white buttercream and couldn't resist adding on some mini chocolate chips. So this cake had a lot of different components, but I loved the way it turned out and it was definitely worth it in the end. So now it's time to cut into the cake and see those gorgeous layers that we made. So as you guys can see, we have those beautiful layers of chocolate and matcha cake, and now there's nothing left to do but taste test. Don't forget, you guys, if you want to recreate this cake, the recipe's up on Chelsweets.com. And I highly recommend it. That matcha frosting is to die for. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any ideas for cakes you'd like to see in the future, please let me know in the comment section below.